Okay, so what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the concept of the Anthropocene, something that you're going to come across a lot in either a master's course over this term, and look a little bit at the idea of where this comes from. And I should say that you're more than welcome to interrupt and interject throughout the lecture. You know, there's plenty of time I've allowed for discussion and interjection, so if there's anything you want to discuss or question or explore further, feel free to interrupt during the lecture. And at the end there's also time where I'd actually like to turn the tables on you, and I will be asking you to have some discussion around some of the ideas around the Anthropocene and what you think and what opinions you have around that. So be prepared to be interactive in this course. So I'll kick off by asking how many of you, before coming to Oxford, have either written about the Anthropocene in an essay or a paper, or used it in some sense? You may have heard about it, but how many of you use that concept in your work? So about, it seems like half to two-thirds of you may have come across that. So it's becoming an increasingly common term that's being used. And what provoked me to write this lecture was the way that it was being used across the environmental sciences in lots of different ways, all in a vague sense indicating modern environmental concerns. But often people, when they have a title, something in the Anthropocene, are using that idea of the Anthropocene in subtly different ways. And what this lecture does is try and provide some context from where this concept came from, what it means, how different types of users are using it in different ways. So you have a better understanding of this concept and its strengths and its weaknesses. So I'm going to kick off with an image, which I think has become one of the iconic images of our time. And this is the image of the Earth at night, where you see this finite planet, and you also see it lit up by human activity, by the night lights, mainly around urban activity around the world. And if you watch this image over time, it's quite mesmerizing. You see gradually light spreading out over areas that previously didn't have electric access, such as Africa, rural South Asia and other places. So you see the spread of modern industrial organized civilization across the face of the Earth, and that has come with a lot of benefit to a lot of humanity, but as well as being a mesmerizing image, it can be quite a troubling image. And the troubling part of it comes when you realize all of this activity is occurring just under a few kilometers of atmosphere, within a few meters of biosphere, and on top of a few centimeters of soil. And there's a sense of questioning around how much activity can be sustained on this thin shell on the outside of our planet before we start disrupting the functioning of that shell in its entirety and start causing more fundamental problems in the sustainability of life on Earth and human civilization on Earth. And this is the concept that the Anthropocene has been trying to capture. And what the Anthropocene is this proposed current geological age in which humans have a major influence on climate and the environment. And it's about more than just climate change. This is an important distinction. It is also about all the other aspects of human distortion of the planetary cycles, whether it's harvesting of resources, whether it's about loss of habitat or conversion of natural habitats to agriculture for human use, and or the release of waste products from our activity into the atmosphere or the oceans. And the Anthropocene tries to capture this sense of overall human domination or disruption of natural planetary cycles. And if you Google or go to a bookshop, you can find a whole range of literature well beyond the natural science origins of the Anthropocene, exploring it or using it as a little bit of a zeitgeist, just a useful phrase to try and capture contemporary thought. So there can be from a journalist travelogues around a changing Earth, in the case of Adventures in the Anthropocene, very, very technical, legalistic things on global environmental constitutionalism in the Anthropocene, or love in the Anthropocene, wildlife in the Anthropocene, learning to die in the Anthropocene. So it's become a bit of a zeitgeist, a spirit of an age, a phrase that's being used more and more outside of its scientific origins. And just last month I had a paper come out that describes much of the content of this lecture. It should be all in all your reading lists or on WebLearn. And that if you want to delve in more deeply into some of the concepts and the literature behind them, I recommend that you look at this paper that this whole lecture is based around. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is look at the perspective on the Anthropocene from a range of disciplines. And if you look at the specific literature, it tends to focus on one discipline. Either it's a geologist talking about the stratigraphic case for the Anthropocene, or earth system scientists, or cultural philosophers having a philosophical perspective on it. But it's relatively rare to examine all the different disciplines and how they view the Anthropocene and what the tensions are between those viewpoints. And what I'm going to try and do here is take you through a journey through some of these different disciplines. And I'll start off with the perspective of the earth system sciences. This is the perspective that my own discipline is within. We look at the functioning of the Earth as the interaction of different systems, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and how these different components of the Earth interact with each other to form the basic functioning, the metabolism of the Earth. And this is a discipline that really began in the 70s and the 80s with the advent of satellites to monitor the Earth, with sophisticated computers that could begin to build first climate models and then Earth system models, and a range of observational systems around the world collecting data to go into our Earth system perspective. And it was an Earth system scientist, Paul Crutzen, the only environmental scientist to win the Nobel Prize for science to date, for his work on the ozone layer, along with his colleagues. And the apocryphal story is that he was at a conference in the late 1990s where a range of people were presenting work on environmental change in the Holocene, the current geological age. And then he stood up in the middle of someone's talk, or at the end of someone's talk, and said, but we're not in the Holocene anymore, we're in something else, we're in the Anthropocene. And he sort of blurted out that this possible new name for this new era. And that led to a paper in a relatively obscure journal, the Global Change Newsletter, in 2000, with a limnologist, Sturmner, who had been using this term in his lectures for a few years before. That had a very limited circulation, didn't get much traction, but the significant event that brought this into wider scientific awareness was this just one-page opinion piece in Nature in 2002, titled The Geology of Mankind, where Paul Crutzen makes this case for us possibly being the human activity being sufficient to have caused the initiation of a new geological epoch. And it was just a short piece, just a one page. It made a broad argument, but didn't really go into a strong scientific justification for the case. It just simply expressed an opinion. Maybe we're in a new geological age. He proposed that it could have started in the late 18th century, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And this got picked up. There was a limited amount of literature emerging in the years after this paper. But a significant development happened in 2007 when Paul Crutzen teamed up with Will Steffen, an Earth system scientist, and John McNeill, who's an environmental historian, and wrote this paper in Ambio that laid out a more considered scientific case for the Anthropocene. So what's the evidence that human activity is sufficient, that is disrupting natural planetary cycles? And this paper expands further. They also, in this, begin to revise their ideas and suggest that actually maybe the Anthropocene really begins around the mid-20th century, in the post-World War II period, when industrial activity both picked up in scale, but also spread outside of its European, North American core to much of the wider world. And in this Earth system science perspective on the Anthropocene, there are a number of features that define this perspective. One is that combined human activity is now large enough to have a substantial effect on planetary function. This is the core concept of this Earth system science view of the Anthropocene. It's a multifaceted view, so it isn't just about climate change, which is where the prevailing global change ideas have been prior to this, but it includes resource extraction, waste production, over-harvesting of plant life and wildlife, and land cover change. And these impacts are breaching or have the potential to breach planetary boundaries, which are limits to the disruption of particular biogeochemical cycles that the planet can sustain, and are leading to, or could lead to, fundamental shifts in the functioning of the Earth system. And because there are feedbacks occurring where human activity is large relative to planetary natural functioning, there's an entanglement between the two. So decisions that we make about food, what type of food we eat, or what type of energy system we have global and planetary consequences for the first time in human history. Human activities have always had local environmental consequences. That's something that's present throughout human history, but it's only now in the Anthropocene that we're starting to see planetary entanglements there. And there are also teleconnections between different global regions. So decisions in Europe on how we feed our cattle, or is it on soy from the Amazon or from other sources, or where we source our vegetable oils from, have planetary consequences. The economic teleconnections mean that deforestation in Borneo is affected by decisions on oil use in Europe or North America. And one of the unique features of this term, a lot of other terms could have been invented, but Paul Crutzen suggests the geological term, probably not with deep consideration on using why to use a geological term, but the idea there is that this was a significant event in the history of the Earth, that it isn't a local, century-long, decade-long environmental event. It's something fundamentally shifting in the nature of the history of the Earth, and it was leaving a distinct stratigraphic record, so hence it was appropriate to define a new geological epoch. And the work by Steffen and Crutzen and McNeill particularly focused on this time of the late 20th century, the mid 20th century, as a key period of this transition. And what we saw first in that original paper, and then in 2015 there was a revised paper on this concept of the Great Acceleration. And you see these types of graphs that have become part of the iconography of the Anthropocene, the general pattern of something rising over time, and in many cases often showing a distinct phase shift or step change around the mid 20th century. And there can be a range of environmental indicators such as carbon dioxide concentration, other trace gases, ocean acidification, degradation of the terrestrial biosphere, a whole range of variables. Or there can be a range of socio-economic variables, such as the population on Earth, real GDP, primary energy use, water use, telecommunications, all this sense of things really ramped up in the mid to late 20th century on what was happening before. And this is and the idea here is that it all began around the mid 20th century, partially with the redirection of World War II wartime economies to mass production and mass industrialization after the Second World War, and combined with the spread of this industrialization into the large, frequent, many newly independent countries in Asia and later on in Africa and beyond. Another concept that is almost a parallel concept to the Anthropocene, but it certainly is in many ways an Anthropocene concept, is this idea of planetary boundaries, that there are fundamental limits to how much disruption human activity can place on the planet before we start seeing fundamental shifts in the functioning of the planet. This idea was originally proposed by Rockström and others in around 2009. More recently in 2015 there's an updated version of this, and you'll come across this more. Kate Raworth will talk about this more in her lectures. And the idea is that there are some boundaries that maybe we are already exceeding, maybe in terms of integrity of the biosphere or in the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. There are others that we have the potential to exceed. So climate change, once it goes past some critical threshold, ocean acidification is another example. And this idea has also been controversial. There's a debate about how many boundaries are truly planetary. Climate change, ocean acidification, they could be argued to be planetary boundaries. Many of the others are perhaps more just an accumulation of local boundaries. The nitrogen cycle, biodiversity loss, land use change. They maybe aren't best described as planetary boundaries. They're much more as local and regional thresholds. But it's certainly a concept that has gained traction, just like the Anthropocene has, and the two are very interrelated in their conceptualization. So the early ideas of the Anthropocene came from this very much this Earth system science perspective. It wasn't really a geological concept. The first 5-6 years there was no significant geologists involved in the literature on the Anthropocene. But as it began to gain traction, the geological community said, well, hold on, this is a geological term being used here. Surely the earth sciences, the geological sciences, should have some say in what this term is and how it's being used. The geological interest began to kick off around 2008. Jan Salasiewicz from the University of Leicester and others presented this paper from a geological perspective, arguing, are we now living in the Anthropocene? Is there geological evidence that justifies this being called a new geological epoch? And just to give you some sense of the geological time scale, it stretches back to the origins of the Earth 4.6 billion years ago, and at broad scales is divided into eons and then eras. So the Cenozoic is the latest era we're in, and this stretches back 65 million years to the demise of the dinosaurs and an asteroid impact and the rise of the mammals after that period. And then the eras are divided into periods. We're in the Quaternary period, and they are divided into epochs that can be generally a few million years long, and the one before last was the Pleistocene epoch that goes back to 2 million years, and with the start of the glaciations and the ice ages, when there started to be ice sheets spreading across much of the northern hemisphere, acidification in the tropics, and this variation between long ice ages and short warm interglacials. They can also be divided into stages and finer details. And then the Holocene is defined as beginning around 11.7 million years ago. And this was the end of the 11.7 thousand years ago. And this was the end of the last strong ice age and into the current interglacial. And these interglacials happen every 100,000 years or so. So the only thing that made the Holocene perhaps distinct from previous interglacials was that this was the period in which humans shifted from a hunter-gatherer phase into an agricultural civilizations around the world. So the Holocene already is distinguished by human activity and presence. That's why it's defined as a distinct geological epoch compared to previous interglacials. So one of the debates about the Anthropocene is how is it different from the Holocene? Because the Holocene is implicitly involving human activity. And then the proposal is that the Anthropocene follows after, it's a geological epoch, so it follows at some point after the Holocene with a debate about when it starts. There are arguments that the shifts that we're seeing are so fundamental that the epoch may be too low an order of a geological scale to be appropriate, and we should be thinking of sort of an Anthropozoic era, or an Anthropocene period, a higher order of geological classification that does greater justice to the degree of change that's happening in the Earth system at the current time. But when do we decide how much change is sufficient to make that judgment? And after Jan Salicevic's paper, a committee was convened. This is the working group on the Anthropocene that initially was around 15-20 people, and the most recent form is around 35 people, to come up with a more formal definition of the Anthropocene that would meet geological standards. And so there is a formal definition process that the ultimate decision on the geological timescale is made by the International Union of Geological Sciences, which is the world body of geologists, and a body called the International Commission on Stratigraphy reports to that body and makes recommendations that body votes on. And the working group on the Anthropocene reports to that body and makes recommendations and suggestions to that body. So there's a whole formal structure within the geological sciences for approval and formalization of the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is just one working group. There are other working groups on redefining other geological epochs and periods as well. But the others are very technical, very much focused on purely geological questions. The challenge with the Anthropocene definition, it isn't purely a geological question. There's a lot of other aspects around contemporary environmental change that are folded into it.
What was the interim recommendation made?
So the interim recommendation that was made in 2016, in last year, was that the Anthropocene should be regarded as a new geological epoch. When this recommendation was made, it was often picked up in the media as the scientists have declared the Anthropocene as a new epoch, but there's been no formal agreement and approval of that recommendation. So officially the Anthropocene does not exist as a formal geological period. It's simply still an informal term. And the working group on the Anthropocene will spend the next few years proposing a strict stratigraphic boundary that meets with geological requirements, and identifying suitable markers in stratigraphy that are good, that present a good definition of the Anthropocene. And the earliest that the formal decision will be made is 2020 at the next IUGS meeting, but it could be even later. And it's actually quite a controversial decision within geology, so there's no certainty that the formal approval will actually be given.
So we're still technically in the Holocene?
In terms of the formal geological scale, we're in the Holocene. Okay. Yeah, there is the textbook geological scale has not been modified in that sense. But there are lots of terms both in geology and others that are informal and are still used. The tertiary is one example. So there are lots of it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist as a useful concept, even if it hasn't been formalized within geology. But it often isn't appreciated that the Anthropocene is not a formally recognized scientific term. And this shows that there's been burgeoning academic interest in the Anthropocene since its conception. So this is the number of publications on the subject Anthropocene from Web of Science. So starting with 2002 and Crutzen's paper. And you can see that there was a slow uptake, limited a number of papers emerging. The AWG was set up around 2009. Another important event was a special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 2011 that had a range of scientific perspectives and debates there, and that caused a burgeoning of new literature. At the same time, The Economist had a front cover on Welcome to the Anthropocene, and that suddenly brought it to a wider awareness as a concept beyond the natural sciences. 3 Anthropocene scientific journals had been launched around 2013-2014 that also became hubs for Anthropocene literature, and it's the literature is rising year on year with no hint of slowing down. And so the geologists and the Anthropocene Working Group has published a range of papers on various aspects of their thinking on the Anthropocene. So as they've been going along, they've been publishing papers on various perspectives and various arguments of where their thinking is going, even though there's been no formal definition. And there's been a few dissenting voices, but broadly the recommendations of the Anthropocene Working Group are pushing towards a mid-20th century origin for the Anthropocene, associated with the Great Acceleration. And they actually propose a very specific time in this paper, as one candidate, which is 05/29/21 Mountain War time on July the 16th, 1945, which was the first atmospheric detonation of a nuclear device. And it's not that that nuclear device itself is an agent of change of the Anthropocene, but it acts as a convenient indicator of that time. It's something linked to this industrialization, expansion of this global industrial economy, and it left those and subsequent nuclear reactions left a global atmospheric radioactive signal that provides a very a convenient geological marker for the Anthropocene. And if you look at the amount of activity, it really picked up in the decades after those first detonations, peaking in the 50s and early 60s, when there was a range of atmospheric nuclear tests going on around the world. And then with the introduction of the atmospheric test ban treaty, they began to decline. And so there's a peak in this radioactive signal around the mid-1960s.
Why there has been such effort and focus put into defining a very strict stratigraphic boundary when previous stratigraphic boundaries have been, 65 million years ago, not right down to a date or time. Why is this one so precise?
Well, I think the precision of the boundaries tends to get sharper and sharper for the more recent geological epochs, because it's possible to be much, much sharper. And that is a very valid point, and there are counter arguments saying, well, do we need to worry about such a degree of precision? The fact that it's so recent within human history is one of the arguments that geologists say, well, you can have quite a precise boundary in this case, so why not have a precise boundary? And there's debate about where it is, but it's the fact that it's a very recent proposal. If you go for an earlier definition of the Anthropocene as beginning, say, with the dawn of agriculture, then we can be less precise about it. But as I'll get on to, there is a counter argument that this debate has become excessively geological and stratigraphic, and by focusing very much on the stratigraphic signal, we're missing the point of the concept of the Anthropocene, and it has become a distraction from the core arguments that are there in that concept. And other papers, so there's actually a whole range of possible indicators, stratigraphic indicators for the start of the Anthropocene. It's very hard not to argue that there has been a strong stratigraphic signal, whether it's looking at atmospheric, the radioactive signal, or whether it's plastics or changes in biogeochemical cycles that are left in sediments. There's a number of indicators, or it can also be a paleostratigraphic one in terms of shifts in species and their distributions around the Earth. So the stratigraphic evidence is quite overwhelming for something that would qualify as a new geological epoch. The challenge is that the mid-20th century is such a recent start date that many of these strata are still forming, so it's very hard to get them to match the stricter geological requirements that are needed. But there has also been resistance from within the geological sciences. A number of geologists feel this is an invasion of the geological timescale of their intellectual territory by a concept that's quite alien to the geological sciences. Some of them have dismissed it as an issue of stratigraphy, or pop culture rather than stratigraphy. It's just a environmental fashion everybody will talk about for a few decades, and then it'll blow over, and it's not the place for the geological timescale to be modified to accommodate what they see as an environmental fashion. Others argue that it's too recent a time period to be suited for geological definition. This very problem that it's so recent that geology isn't appropriate for considering this time period. Others argue it's, for example, that it's a political concept, which may be important and valid. We may all agree with the sentiments behind trying to declare the Anthropocene, but the formal structures of the geological timescale are not the place to make such arguments, and in fact they're being strained by decisions that should be purely based on rock sediments and ocean sediments, having a lot of media attention, a lot of political attention. That is not what the geological timescale should be about. Others argue that there's no denying that the Anthropocene is a valuable concept, that there's lots of interesting debates going about it, but there's no need to formalize it. That why worry about all this strict geological definition? Why not just use it as a term that carries salience, that it's a historical or a political concept, it's not a geological concept. So there is resistance within the earth sciences, and it's far from certain that the recommendations of the working group on the Anthropocene will be formally approved and the Anthropocene will be declared a formal geological epoch. There's also a resistance or criticism from others, social scientists in particular, about the excessive geologization of the debate, that it's the working group on the Anthropocene is primarily geologists and scientists. There are a few other people involved, and there's a resistance saying, well, why is it being led? Why is this important environmental and philosophical concept being left to one particular branch of the sciences, a very technical branch of the sciences in many ways, to define? That it should be a much more wider discussion that brings in the social sciences, the history, humanities, in trying to come up with a concept of what the Anthropocene is and when it begins. And this was a little piece in Nature by Earl Ellis, who actually is a member of the working group on the Anthropocene, but he's an environmental ecologist and historian, so has a very different take from the geologists. Some argue that the Anthropocene has been powerful. I think it has been powerful in bringing a multidisciplinary perspective to environmental change. But some have argued that actually it's a very one-way multidisciplinarity. And this is a comment by Malm and Holberg, who've been among the most prominent critics of this Anthropocene perspective from the social sciences, that the Anthropocene resembles an attempt to conceptually traverse the gap between the natural and the social through the construction of a bridge from one side only, leading the traffic, as it were, in a direction opposite to the actual process. In climate change, social relations determine natural conditions, that ultimately environmental change is a social phenomenon impinging on the environment. In Anthropocene thinking, natural scientists extend their worldviews to society. So the systems view of the planet that treats humanity as another component of the system is a very alien view, they argue, to an embedded understanding of the complexity of society, the complexity of humanity, and and they argue that's an excessively systems viewpoint that's being imposed in this concept. So that gives you a view from the geological sciences, which have more recently have had a very prominent role in the Anthropocene debate. A slightly different perspective comes from the ecological sciences. There's the biosphere perspective, which similarly does have a lot of similarities to the Earth system science perspective in being about alteration in the functioning of the planet. But you can imagine ways in which the biosphere can be fundamentally changed while not necessarily altering Earth system function. You could probably lose 70% of the species in the Amazon rainforest, and it would still be a rainforest playing global biogeochemical roles that are similar to the roles it plays now, but something fundamental will have changed in the nature of life on Earth. So this biosphere perspective brings in a certain other viewpoint and set of values that are different from the Earth system disruption viewpoints of the Earth system sciences. And a key part of that is this idea of this mass extinction that is ongoing, with a large fraction of species, around 25% of mammals, around 40% of amphibians, about 13% of birds, are under significant threat from Anthropocene pressures, whether it's direct harvesting, habitat loss, or climate change. So if these species losses do go ahead, something fundamental will have changed in the diversity and the richness of life on Earth. Another key perspective of the biosphere perspective is even in the absence of extinction, there's this huge mixing of biota around the different continents of the planet, either deliberately through human activity or inadvertently in shipments and travel and transport. And some have described this change as the creation of a new Pangea. It's almost like a global tectonic event where the long separated continents of the Earth have been pushed together virtually into a single new Pangea, a new supercontinent, with this exchange of species occurring across the different continents. And that's caused extinction, but it's also caused the appearance of distinct species where they didn't exist before. And from a geological perspective or paleontological perspective, if some future paleontologist tens of millions of years from now came and looked at Earth's stratigraphic record, they'd have no doubt that something extraordinary happened in Earth history at this time, that new species appeared in different continents where they weren't previously. There may have been an overall loss in diversity, but suddenly the story of the history of life on Earth on the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of year timescale changed in this period because of this biotic event, this grand mixing and extinction. So on that paleostratigraphic record, it's unambiguous that we'd see a very strong Anthropocene signal that will persist for tens or hundreds of millions of years in a stratigraphic record.
This might be a little too specific, but has there been any research into the numerical representation of the speed at which, say, on the microbiotic level, things are, the speed of evolution is changing?
There are debates about that the speed of speciation is increasing now with all these changes and all these pressures going on. And in fact, that there are a number of perspectives of this contemporary change. Perhaps the conventional perspective has been this idea of the significance of this large extinction event, this mixing, particularly species and islands are going extinct. Endemics are particularly under threat and decreasing in abundance. Interesting that there's an interesting side counter perspective by Chris Thomas, this book that just came out this summer, and Chris is coming to give a talk to us in January, which will be in this department about this work, and we'll make a bit of a debate around this, which takes a slightly longer term perspective on this and says that yes, there is a loss of endemics going on at the moment, but if you look at total biodiversity, it's increasing in most regions. It's increasing over time by this mixture of invasive species, a mixture of habitats. So if you go to a Pacific island like Hawaii, you do see huge loss of biodiversity. A lot of endemics have been lost, but the total functional diversity, species diversity of Hawaii has increased over time. And yes, there is a tragedy in the loss of the species, but what's happening is rather than creating a global supercontinent, what's actually been created is a global archipelago, and there's new speciation going on in these new islands with these invasive species then beginning to speciate. So if we took a 10 million year timescale perspective, this actually could be a surge of speciation and a new biological diversity going on. There's a highly controversial viewpoint, but whatever viewpoint you take, there's certainly this sense of a huge alteration of the biological world occurring at the present time. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to a different time scale and take a historical perspective on the Anthropocene. And as I've said up until now, the prevailing narrative has been moving towards the mid-20th century being the starting point for the Anthropocene, the start of this great acceleration. But there's a persistent counter-narrative that says, no, actually the Anthropocene is a much older event. The humans have been fundamentally altering the environment for a lot longer than the mid-20th century, and we should go for an earlier start date for the Anthropocene. And the debate is interesting in itself, but also I think it's interesting because it reflects different underlying mindsets about how we understand contemporary human alteration of the Earth system. Is it something new drastic that's happening, that's fundamentally different from anything else in human history and before? Or is this a continuation of something that humans have been doing from throughout the history and prehistory, from when fire was invented or megafaunal animals were hunted out, or other aspects? So part of it is trying to understand our contemporary environmental time in the context of a deeper human and Earth history. And so a range of possible starting dates have been proposed. And this graph gives you an indication of some of these ideas. So the y-axis is some non-linear, non-quantitative metric of human influence on the planet. And here we have time, years before the present and years into the future. And a range of ideas have been suggested. Some have suggested that maybe the first human capture of fire and conversion to meat eating by Homo erectus, even before Homo sapiens, which led to our expansion of our brains with these meat-rich diets. And maybe that's an appropriate time to think of the Anthropocene starting. Others associate the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa, which was associated with the extinction of large animals, the megafauna, in most other continents around the world, particularly the Americas and Australia. And maybe that's an appropriate time when we started altering the nature of the ecology of the Earth on a significant scale. Others suggest the spread of farming around 10,000 years ago, and more with the origin of farming, and more recently for the spread in the last few thousand years, or large-scale mining occurring around the time of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China, when large mining civilizations appeared. Another proposal is the European conquest of the Americas, I'll get to in a moment, or the start of the Industrial Revolution, the Great Acceleration I already talked about. And others suggest maybe actually the Anthropocene hasn't actually begun yet, but it could be said to begin when we pass some critical threshold, like 2 degrees of global warming. So it's a state that we're trying to avoid, rather than one that we're already in and trying to adapt to. And Ellis and others in this piece in Nature make this argument for the deep roots to the Anthropocene, that there are a lot of some things that are undoubtedly local. So when humans were hunting out the local environment or modifying the local environment, there were local environmental feedbacks, but there were no real Earth system feedbacks. It didn't accumulate to that. It's not really an Earth system process, but at a local level, humans are modifying the environment for a long time. There's arguments that some changes, such as the megafaunal extinctions or the origins of agriculture, were large enough to actually begin to show a noticeable effect in the functioning of the planet in terms of greenhouse gas or energy balance. And the one fundamental thing about the Anthropocene is that it's entangled in human activity, and like all human events, there's very often rarely a distinct beginning or an end to it. Things have diffuse origins. One example has been made as a comparison with the Renaissance, that if you look at European history, it's sort of easy to spot the Renaissance when you see it, and this surging of ideas and in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. But it's hard to define when the Renaissance actually began, because it's entangled with all the subtleties of human history and influences and gradual change. And similarly, the Anthropocene is like that. You can spot the Anthropocene when you're truly in it, but you can't really say when it began, because it's all diffuse in its origins. And just to give you an example of some of these points, the megafaunal extinctions, if we'd been around on Earth in the previous interglacial at 100,000 years ago, we'd have seen large creatures everywhere. So the scenes that we associate with the African national parks now were scenes that we would have seen across Europe, across the Americas, and with a very different group of species also in Australia. And most of these large animals were wiped out when Homo sapiens arrived in these other continents. There's some debate about the role that climate change versus Homo sapiens played in those extinctions, but when you take the global view, it's very hard to argue against the role that humans played. That firstly, there were previous interglacials with rapid climate change, where the megafauna persisted through without significant extinctions. And when you look at the different timings, the megafauna disappeared in Australia around 50,000 years ago when humans arrived there. They disappeared from the Americas around 10 to 15,000 years ago when humans arrived there. And on a smaller scale, they disappeared from Madagascar, New Zealand, all around the time of human arrival. So when you look at this cascading coincidence of megafaunal extinction and human arrival, it's very hard to get away from a direct human cause. And this is an interesting thing because it challenges this idea of human alteration of the environment, human effects on biodiversity as being something modern. It's something deep in human history, the way that humans have been wiping out creatures around them, particularly larger creatures. And so it also challenges this idea of, say, pre-industrial or pre-agricultural times being somehow more in equilibrium with the environment, and that equilibrium was disrupted only by modernity. The dawn of agriculture occurred at the start of the Holocene, and we see independently, as climate stabilized after the last ice age, we see agriculture appearing in very independent forms in very isolated and remote areas. So we see crops such as squash and arrowroot and potato and maize appearing in the Americas, sorghum being domesticated in Africa, the banana and the yam in Papua New Guinea, rice in East Asia. So lots of independent centers of domestication, suggesting that humans, this hadn't happened in previous interglacials, suggests that during that last interglacial humans had developed a complex enough language, a complex enough society that they were able to share and communicate ideas in a much more advanced manner. And as soon as the climate stabilized at the end of the last ice age, it was possible for agricultural civilizations to independently originate and spread. Bill Ruddiman and others argue that this agricultural spread should be considered a start of the Anthropocene because the effects weren't just local. He argues that some of the changes with the spread of agriculture had global consequences, and in particular the spread of wetland farming, rice agriculture, led to a release of methane that he argues was sufficient to delay the next ice age. He argues that we will already be slipping into an ice age now if it wasn't for all this methane being emitted from rice farming in Asia. And so this could be seen as a global effect of significance. Now this is controversial. Others have argued that it's very hard to predict when ice ages would have occurred. The consensus seems to be that it wouldn't have occurred now. It would have taken another several thousand or tens of thousands of years before we slipped into the next ice age. And it's debated whether this methane emission from wetland farming was sufficient to alter it. So it's a contentious argument, but there is an argument that early agriculture was significant enough to alter the atmosphere and the climate. Another date that was proposed a few years ago by Lewis and Maslin was around 1500. And this is when, up until that date, the New World the Americas had been essentially an independent experiment in civilization. There'd been some limited contact, maybe with the Vikings and the Polynesians, but essentially American civilization had grown up in isolation compared to Old World civilization. And around 1500, these two civilization spheres collided in a largely one-sided exchange. So Mexico City, Teotihuacan, around 1519 was probably the largest city on Earth, rivaled by some cities in China. But it's a vast, an independent experiment in civilization. And the European conquest of the Americas was associated with a big decline in the population of the Americas through disease, through slavery, through conquest. It's debated how large the decline was, but figures around 90% decline are often estimated. So a huge collapse in the population of the Americas. And some argue, Lewis and Maslin argue that was large enough to cause a regrowth of forests in the Americas that you can see in the as a small dip in the atmospheric CO2 signal around 1650, linked to the collapse of agriculture in the Americas. It was also a time of a huge exchange of previously isolated crops. So the Old World crops, such as tropical crops such as banana and sugarcane, moved from the Old World to the New World. and many new world crops such as potato or tomato, squash and pumpkins moved to the old world. So again, any stratigraphic record would have this strong signal of this exchange of species between the continents at this time. And a different argument also comes from a political economy argument that the 1500s was the time of the origin of the capitalist world system, that the sudden access of Europe to all the resources of America and its collapsed populations led to the ability to mass mobilize resources, to re-engineer the economies around the acquisition and movement of resources, and led to the formation of the capitalist world system. And so that further pushed through to the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. So there are arguments beyond purely the ecological arguments. Something significant happened around 1500. So there are these counter perspectives. So this is a picture of Earl Ellis, one of the key proponents for these early Anthropocene arguments, and he argues that this early Anthropocene viewpoint emphasizes this long history of human alteration of the environment. That isn't something new, it's been happening throughout human history. And it's a persistent aspect of humanity and of human success. And it recognizes there are contemporary environmental challenges, but they're a continuation of this long process of human environmental interactions and human environmental challenges. And the defining attribution of the Anthropocene is human modification of the environment of whatever scale. It doesn't have to be these Earth system scales, it can be at local scales. There are others that argue that this is completely missing the point of the Anthropocene, and there's some vigorous debates in the literature where people accuse the other one of just not getting it, not getting the point. And Clive Hamilton is amongst the most vocal proponents for saying that this early Anthropocene argument is fundamentally flawed. He emphasized that the Anthropocene is about something new that's happening, that isn't a continuation of earlier processes. It may be influenced by earlier activities, but it's a rupture with the past that has occurred with human domination of the Earth system that began in the 20th century. And the challenge is now planetary. It isn't about how we live sustainably in our local environment, it's how we live within planetary boundaries. And this is something new and not simply an extension of previous historical challenges that we might have had. And the defining attribute of the Anthropocene that we should remember is it's about human domination of the Earth system. And this is closest to the original Crutzen argument for the Anthropocene. And he argues that these early Anthropocene arguments are missing this point. And it fails to recognize the extreme crisis of the present, and it has a danger of normalizing environmental change. If humans have always been altering the environment and it becomes, perhaps there isn't something so drastic or urgent about a contemporary environmental time. It's simply a continuation of a challenge that we faced throughout human history. And he has a book out that also came out this year. There's a huge volume of literature on the Anthropocene. So when I'm writing a review, it was quite a challenge just to get to grips with this. And it's every month there are new books and new papers emerging. But this is a particularly powerful one by Clive called Defiant Earth, The Fate of Humans in the Anthropocene. It's not the cheeriest reading on the planet, but it's definitely powerfully written. So the debates about the origins of the Anthropocene do reflect it's interesting because it does reflect how we think about it and conceptualize contemporary environmental change. And is it about, so when we define the Anthropocene, do we consider the start of the process of human alteration, or the step change or surge in human alteration that occurred around the 20th century? And some have offered compromise positions. Foley argues that we could have an informal term, the Paleoanthropocene, to describe periods up to the mid-20th century, and then have the Anthropocene beginning then. Others argue that we're in the middle of a 1,000-year early Anthropocene transition, which began around 1500 with the conquest of the Americas, and now carry on for hundreds of years now. We're just in the middle of this period of transition that lasts around 1,000 years, which is just a number plucked out of the air in terms of duration. As I said, an argument can be made that the Anthropocene is not something that we've hit now, but is something that we would hit if humanity breaches fundamental planetary boundaries, such as the climate change boundary. If warming passes some sort of threshold where we start seeing feedbacks in the Earth system, with, for example, the biosphere stopping being a sink of carbon dioxide and becoming a source of carbon dioxide, that further accelerates climate change into a new state. So in this sense, the Anthropocene is something that is approaching and something that we may want to try and avoid rather than enter. Okay, so the arguments I've given before have been from a range of academic disciplines, whether the Earth system sciences, the geological sciences, the ecological sciences, or historical perspective. One fascinating thing about the Anthropocene is in the last 5 or 6 years, it's spilled out of these academic debating literature into a much wider cultural zeitgeist in lots of interesting and quite creative ways. As I said, one significant event in this, I think, was this cover of The Economist in 2011 that suddenly brought this idea of the Anthropocene to a much wider audience, along with other events at that time. And it's been described as a charismatic mega category, something that it's easy to bring a range of our concerns about the environment. And I often find when you try and describe something about environmental change, which is not just about climate change, but it's also about wastes and other aspects, but on whatever scale, sometimes the easiest way to capture all those concepts is to talk about in the Anthropocene. And this is how people often use this term when they're talking about the range of multi-scaled, multifaceted environmental change that's occurring. Often a very convenient label, a very shorthand label, is to talk about change, that change in the Anthropocene. So it kind of captures concerns about the magnitude and breadth of contemporary human influence in the wider natural world. And as the slide I showed earlier, this was a random selection that I picked up in 10 minutes of Googling for titles in the Anthropocene, but you can see the range of literature. This is all from the last year or two, all these books, so there's many more. Another selection here, the Manifesto for Living in the Anthropocene, Bats in the Anthropocene, Ecological Economics or Religion in the Anthropocene. So it's become this useful phrase for capturing contemporary concerns and changes. But they use the Anthropocene in different ways. Some of them are very far from this Earth system science perspective origins of the Anthropocene, but it doesn't mean they're any less valid. But I think it captures the power of this term, that it is able to be so flexible and be used to capture the contemporary situation. There's been a range of artworks and cultural works, sounds of the Anthropocene. This is an underwater sculpture called the Anthropocene. A cartography of the Anthropocene. You can find many other bits of cultural and artwork around this. So it's spilled out of the natural sciences, and this is important to remember, because sometimes we can focus excessively on the scientific debate around the Anthropocene without recognizing its potency as a term, as a wider term, that actually in some ways now is more significant than its formal scientific definition. But it can mean different things to different people, how it's used. So when you see a title, next time you see a title, and probably many of the lectures that many of you will go to this week, have a reflection on how the Anthropocene is being used and how different it is perhaps from title to title. So to many that it's been used in this Earth system science original sense, where humanity is bouncing against and rupturing planetary boundaries. Others use it in a very geological sense, as a distinct event in Earth history that is recorded in the stratigraphic record. Others just use it as a catch-all term for the modern world, essentially, this modern world where human influence is pervasive. Whether it's an Earth system process or not, the fact that the natural world is constantly affected by human activity. A world after nature, in inverted commas, where the natural no longer exists. But although it could be argued that a lot of the early Anthropocene arguments actually question this idea of separation between human and natural. Human and nature have been interacting since the origins of humanity within within the natural world. And so there's a debate about whether the Anthropocene represents the end of nature or not. Or it can simply mean all of Earth history touched by human activity, and that can go all the way back to the first use of fire or the extinction of the megafauna. There are very different ways that the Anthropocene can be used. It can also be a point of ideological provocation. It captures concerns about the magnitude of contemporary human influence on the wider natural world, and it can use as a provocation, challenges ideas of progress, of growth, of modernity. There have also been criticisms of the concept from the social scientists and humanities. Some argue that this very framing of the systems framing or geological framing of the Anthropocene encourages this very technocentric, large-scale systems view of the world that is a very Western view of the world and doesn't really have much resonance in non-Western cultures or thinking. Others argue, well, what is this anthropos in the Anthropocene, this collective we? Many of these criticisms are about what's being missed out in this term, and you could argue, well, actually no single term could be expected to capture all the nuances and subtleties, but some critics argue that actually there's more danger in the simplicity of this term than utility, that lumping all of humanity into this single anthropos ignores that particular economic and power configurations are responsible for the Anthropocene. So this, it could be argued that this capitalist neoliberal worldview is a big component of what's causing the Anthropocene, and whose Anthropocene is it? That much of the disruption has been caused thus far by a relatively small fraction of humanity. Is it actually disingenuous to try and lump all of these activities in some collective human influence when it's only a subset of humanity that is responsible for much of Anthropocene change? Books that argue around this phrase books by Jason Moore and others who propose this term, the Capitalocene, rather than the Anthropocene, to describe this time, that there's linked very much to the political, economic configurations of capital that are causing this disruption. So the Capitalocene is just one example. This one interesting phenomenon is that this scene, this geological suffix, the scene itself, has become a meme, a cultural meme. And a lot of people have proposed alternative titles for the contemporary time, sometimes as a serious proposition, but often just as a way of just stirring it a bit and provoking thinking and counter thinking. So the Technocene, that is a technology-dominated geological era. The Misanthropocene, which argues that what this Anthropocene thinking is doing is encouraging this dislike, this catastrophic dislike of humanity as a whole. It has a strong misanthropic quality about it that should be avoided. The Anthroponocene, that argues that against this very Western industrial technocentric view of the world, and there's lots of other world views, indigenous views, other cultural views that need to be recognized and brought into this discussion, and they're not seen in this Anthropocene discussion. The Manthropocene. This was Kate Raworth's commentary, commenting both on the Anthropocene working group being almost overwhelmingly male. I think it's 32 out of 35, but also perhaps the male-dominated society is playing a major role in bringing the Anthropocene about. The Anglocene was another term that recognizing that the Anglo world, Britain, North America, have played a major role both in the initial cause of the Anthropocene, but also and now the debate on defining the Anthropocene is very much still strongly in the English-speaking world. The significant literature occurs, and again, most of these are very far from anything that would come close to meeting any sort of geological criterion for something significant on Earth system history. But it shows that the way the Anthropocene has become a powerful tool for provocation of ideas and challenging ideas in itself through this idea of the scene. Okay, so what I've done thus far is look at ways the Anthropocene concept has been originated, conceived, criticized, defined, But many would argue, well, actually, all of these things are interesting. What's most important about the Anthropocene is how we respond to it, what we do with the Anthropocene, not how we define it. And that there are a variety of perspectives. There's a huge literature on how we try and respond to, whether we formally call it the Anthropocene or something else. How we, and I can't really touch on that, but just give you an idea of the range of perspectives and worldviews that come into this debate. And some would argue that the implicit in much of the writing is some sort of pragmatic planetary management, that humanity, whether has stumbled into the Anthropocene. You could argue how much through deliberate choice of particular economic or power systems, or just there was an inevitability about it. You can argue about that, but humanity has found itself in this new and uncomfortable situation of bouncing up against planetary boundaries. And what we need to do is somehow reconcile living within these planetary boundaries, while also recognizing that the Anthropocene brings about much good in terms of development, reduction of poverty. We've seen huge reductions in poverty worldwide over the 20th century, and somehow we have to reconcile bringing people out of deprivation while staying within planetary boundaries. And this is something that Kate will talk about a lot in her lectures, and within this context of this planetary donut. There are other ways of conceiving of this idea, but the overall idea is that what is our duty to do is, now having discovered that we're breaching planetary boundaries and we're in the Anthropocene, is working out a strategy for gardening the Anthropocene, essentially, for how do we recognize that we're in a human-dominated and a human-altered planet? What's our best strategy to stay within sustainable boundaries on this planet? And this is the prevailing mindset and something that dominates our environmental thinking around the 21st century at all scales. Others are less cautious in their interpretation of the Anthropocene, and so they recognize that it is something new and a challenge. They don't deny the Anthropocene exists, but actually take a more Promethean view of this, a more optimistic view, and say, actually, we've got to not tiptoe around the Anthropocene. We've got to grapple the Anthropocene with all our technology and all our insights. So take an active interventionist approach in the Anthropocene. Use technology such as nuclear power to shift our energy base. Think actively of encouraging urbanization and cities as a way of decreasing pressure on rural landscapes, that allows landscapes to be rewilded and nature to come back. Possibly consider some types of geoengineering as a way of controlling it. So the argument there is using human ingenuity and technology to grapple the Anthropocene, and not be shy about recognizing that we are a dominant force on the planet, and we should use our skills to navigate that, navigate this landscape. And this is best captured in the phenomenon of eco-modernism, which we launched a manifesto a couple of years ago. It was particularly active in this thinking has been something called the Breakthrough Institute, that's based in California, and has a very optimistic Californian technology-driven view of the environment, and have the role that technology can play in solving our environmental challenges. And this is a multiple-page manifesto. There are many strands of eco-modernism, so it's very hard to really pin down as eco-modernism is this. But the basic idea is captured in the opening paragraphs. So there's a recognition that humans dominate, and the Anthropocene has begun. And the second paragraph says, as scholars, scientists, and campaigners and citizens, we write with the conviction that knowledge and technology, applied with wisdom, might allow for a good or even a great Anthropocene. A good Anthropocene demands that humans use their growing social, economic, and technological powers to make life better for people, stabilize the climate, and protect the natural world. So it carries on in detail beyond that. It's worth having a look at that manifesto. Needless to say, it's been hugely controversial as an approach, and there's been a lot of response that's been vigorously attacking this worldview. But it also has captured a lot of interest from a lot of people. But then there's also, at the other end of the spectrum, So you have this is all entirely a spectrum that recognise the Anthropocene. You could argue there's significant sections, including significant powerful sections of humanity, don't seem to recognise the Anthropocene existing as a challenge at all. But within those, I recognise that there's another one which is a much more Cassandra-like, you could say, catastrophist view of the Anthropocene, that we don't recognise the seriousness of what's happening now, that an incremental view of living sustainably on a human-dominated planet doesn't recognise how radical the change in the nature of our societies of global civilization has to be if we're not to avoid breaching fundamental boundaries. And Clive Hamilton is certainly amongst the most prolific writer on this. There's another book. Both the people who write this tend to be extremely good writers in the sense that they write like poets. So even if you don't buy the message, you go quite sucked into their writing. Roy Scranton, who talks about how we should reflect on the end of a civilization as we're coming into the Anthropocene. It means the end of human civilization. There's just one little quote from Clive. This is much more than about particular power configurations. It's about a re-evaluation of the entire idea of human progress. So this is a little quote from Clive. The forces that we hoped would make the world a more civilized place, personal freedoms, democracy, material advance, technological power, are in truth paving the way to its destruction. The powers that we most trusted have betrayed us. That which we believed would save us now threatens to devour us. So powerful stuff there as well on the and you could say this is very gloomy, but people like Clive would argue that actually you need someone to actually shout and say actually this is a far more serious situation than an incrementalist view of the environment and managing the environment can cope with. Okay, so I'll conclude by that I gave you a whole range, a little tour of the Anthropocene. I could easily have given the same lecture with a completely different set of slides and literature. There's such a huge amount of literature out there and different viewpoints of how to navigate that literature. But that gives you just one example of the literature there. So I'll conclude by asking, is the Anthropocene a useful concept? There are arguments that it is useful. It captures the magnitude of human domination of the Earth system and a distinct rupture from the way the world has been in the past. It emphasizes the multifaceted nature of contemporary environmental change, that it goes beyond this idea of climate change, that actually even if we solve the fossil fuel problem in the next decade through switching to solar or clean energy, many of the other Anthropocene problems would still be there. The climate change is just one disciplines and how they view the Anthropocene and what the tensions are between those viewpoints. And what I'm going to try and do here is take you through a journey through some of these different disciplines. And I'll start off with the perspective of the Earth system sciences. This is the perspective that my own discipline is within. We look at the functioning of the Earth as the interaction of different systems, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and how these different components of the Earth interact with each other to form the basic functioning, the metabolism of the Earth. And this is a discipline that really began in the 70s and the 80s with the advent of satellites to monitor the Earth, with sophisticated computers that could begin to build first climate models and then Earth system models, and a range of observational systems around the world collecting data to go into our Earth system perspective. And it was an Earth system scientist, Paul Crutzen, the only environmental scientist to win the Nobel Prize for science to date, for his work on the ozone layer, along with his colleagues. And the apocryphal story is that he was at a conference in the late 1990s where a range of people were presenting work on environmental change in the Holocene, the current geological age. And then he stood up in the middle of someone's talk, or at the end of someone's talk, and said, but we're not in the Holocene anymore, we're in something else, we're in the Anthropocene. And he sort of blurted out this possible new name for this new era. That led to a paper in a relatively obscure journal, the Global Change newsletter in 2000, with a limnologist, Sturmner, who had been using this term in his lectures for a few years before. That had a very limited circulation, didn't get much traction, but the significant event that brought this into wider scientific Okay, so what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the concept of the Anthropocene, something that you're going to come across a lot in either of a master's course over this term, and look a little bit at the idea of where this comes from. And I should say that you're more than welcome to interrupt and interject throughout the lecture. You know, there's plenty of time we have allowed for discussion and interjection, so if there's anything you want to discuss or question or explore further, feel free to interrupt during the lecture. And at the end, there's also time where I'd like to turn the tables on you, and I will be asking you to have some discussion around some of the ideas around the Anthropocene and what you think and what opinions you have around that. So be prepared to be interactive in this course. So I'll kick off by asking how many of you, before coming to Oxford, have either written about the Anthropocene in an essay or a paper, or used it in some sense. You may have heard about it, but how many of you use that concept in your work? So about like half to 2/3 of you may have come across that. So it's becoming an increasingly common term that's being used. And what provoked me to write this lecture was the way that it was being used across the environmental sciences in lots of different ways, all in a vague sense indicating modern environmental concerns. But often people, when they have a title, something in the Anthropocene, are using that idea of the Anthropocene in subtly different ways. And what this lecture does is try and provide some context from where this concept came from, what it means, how different types of users are using it in different ways. So you have a better understanding of this concept and its strengths and its weaknesses. So I'm going to kick off with an image, agriculture for human use, and the release of waste products from our activity into the atmosphere or the oceans. And the Anthropocene tries to capture this sense of overall human domination or disruption of natural planetary cycles. And if you Google or go to a bookshop, you can find a whole range of literature well beyond the natural science origins of the Anthropocene, exploring it or using it as a little bit of a zeitgeist, just a useful phrase to try and capture contemporary thought. So they can be from a journalist, travel logs around a changing Earth, in the case of Adventures in the Anthropocene, very, very technical, legalistic things on global environmental constitutionalism in the Anthropocene, or love in the Anthropocene, wildlife in the Anthropocene, learning to die in the Anthropocene. So it's become a bit of a zeitgeist, a spirit of an age, a phrase that's being used more and more outside of its scientific origins. And just last month I had a paper come out that describes much of the content of this lecture. It should be in all your reading lists or on WebLearn. And that if you want to delve in more deeply into some of the concepts and the literature behind them, I recommend that you look at this paper that this whole lecture is based around. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is look at the perspective on the Anthropocene from a range of disciplines. And if you look at the specific literature, it tends to focus on one discipline. Either it's a geologist talking about the stratigraphic case for the Anthropocene, or earth system scientists, or cultural philosophers having a philosophical perspective on it. But it's relatively rare to examine all the different disciplines. Awareness was this just one-page opinion piece in Nature in 2002 titled The Geology of Mankind, where Paul Crutzen makes this case for us possibly being the human activity being sufficient to have caused the initiation of a new geological epoch. And it was just a short piece, just a one page. It made a broad argument, but didn't really go into a strong scientific justification for the case. They just simply expressed an opinion. Maybe we're in a new geological age. He proposed that it could have started in the late 18th century, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And this got picked up. There was a limited amount of literature emerging in the years after this paper, but a significant development happened in 2007 when Paul Crutzen teamed up with Will Steffen, an earth system scientist, and John McNeill, who's an environmental historian, and wrote this paper in Ambio that laid out a more considered scientific case for the Anthropocene. So what's the evidence that human activity is sufficient, that is disrupting natural planetary cycles? And this paper expands further. They also, in this, begin to revise their ideas and suggest that actually maybe the Anthropocene really begins around the mid-20th century, in the post-World War II period, when industrial activity both picked up in scale, but also spread outside of its European, North American core to much of the wider world. And in this Earth system science perspective on the Anthropocene, there are a number of features that define this perspective. One is that combined human activity is now large enough to have a substantial effect on planetary function. This is, which I think has become one of the iconic images of our time. And this is the image of the Earth at night, where you see this finite planet, and you also see it lit up by human activity, by the night lights, mainly around urban activity around the world. And if you watch this image over time, it's quite mesmerizing. You see gradually light spreading out over areas that previously didn't have electric access, such as Africa, rural South Asia and other places. So you see the spread of modern industrial organized civilization across the face of the Earth. And that has come with a lot of benefit to a lot of humanity. But as well as being a mesmerizing image, it can be quite a troubling image. And the troubling part of it comes when you realize all of this activity is occurring just under a few kilometers of atmosphere, within a few meters of biosphere, and on top of a few centimeters of soil. And there's a sense of questioning around how much activity can be sustained on this thin shell on the outside of our planet before we start disrupting the functioning of that shell in its entirety and start causing more fundamental problems in the sustainability of life on Earth and human civilization on Earth. And this is the concept that the Anthropocene has been trying to capture. And what the Anthropocene is this proposed current geological age in which humans have a major influence on climate and the environment. And it's about more than just climate change. This is an important distinction. It is also about all the other aspects of human distortion of the planetary cycles, whether it's harvesting of resources, whether it's about loss of habitat or conversion of natural habitats to